don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I talked with Rod Naquin, a high school English teacher from Louisiana. It was fascinating to get Rod's unique perspective on returning to the classroom after 7 years in educational leadership work and his evolving teaching philosophy. As one social media poster noted in response to one of Rod's posts, it's encouraging to see so many teachers learning about the research behind how students learn. I look forward to seeing posts that highlight their successes in the classroom this year. But I would say that for some, the idea of dynamic equilibrium that he describes as he tries to balance evidence-based practice, some would characterize as the science of learning, with the realities of public school teaching and working to move students to complex thinking and learning is likely to create some cognitive dissonance. We unpacked how his teaching has changed from his previous teaching experience before his 7-year hiatus. Some of the ways in which he describes his approach now include emphasizing granular sentence-level instruction and increased dialogue with students to make their complex thinking visible. Rod also discussed the challenges of diagnosing students' foundational understanding, the importance of balancing foundational skills with complex ideas, and the interdependence of knowledge and critical thinking. He explains his concept of applying a dynamic equilibrium in teaching as integrating various instructional approaches and adapting formative assessments based on specific texts. Finally, we touched on the importance of understanding diverse perspectives in dialogue and the logistical hurdles teachers face in engaging with educational research and classroom realities. Rod also regularly publishes on Substack, and you can find that by searching for the title The Science of Dialogue, and I'll be sure to include that link in the show notes as well. As always, I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our professional development and learning options. We emphasize what I call knowledge-rich inquiry, which is meant to use the best of cognitive science and evidence-based practice to help build the knowledge that is necessary for complex learning. That includes our project-based learning work, our differentiation work, and of course our inquiry-specific work, and much more. These practices will also be an integral part of our soon-to-be-released AI PBL design tool that I'm very excited about. More details on that soon to come, as well as our online course for differentiated instruction that is nearly ready for release 2. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Rod. I am with Rod Naquin, and he is down in the New Orleans area and has gone back to the classroom as, I think, a high school English teacher. He'll correct me if I'm wrong and pronounce his name more accurately than I have. And one of the things that I think is going to be interesting about this conversation is the perspective of going back to the classroom after having worked outside of the classroom for 7 years and being more aware of educational research and some of those conversations. So without further ado, I want to give you the opportunity to say welcome and to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell the folks anything that you think is important and necessary in understanding this conversation that's probably going to ensue. Who knows where we're going to go, though?
Yeah, who knows where is a good way to describe it. Thanks, Drew. I'm happy to be here. I'm Rod Naquin, as you said, a little bit west of New Orleans. Southeast Louisiana is where I've been born and raised. Most of my work in education over the last 20 years has been around some Louisiana educational reforms and educational initiatives. I've worked in New Orleans during recovery schools after Katrina, which is a big topic. That's 20 years ago. So I have experience there around charters. I've done a lot of work with the State Department in Louisiana around curricular materials, HQIM. That's a disputed and debated kind of area around the use of curricular materials in classrooms. And I've been primarily a secondary teacher. I taught for about 10 plus years prior to going into ed reform and educational leadership about 7 years ago. where I did a lot more work with teachers, alongside teachers with curriculum materials, alongside leaders walking in classrooms, primarily around literacy instruction and the use of instructional materials. And then this summer, I decided to go back to teaching. So it's been the world is a little bit different from 7 years ago when I was last a teacher of record. But this fall, I'm teaching juniors English 3, English language arts, and I'm teaching literature to seniors under advanced placement. So it's been a journey coming back after those 7 years. I blog about it and write about kind of what this intersection of educational research and classroom practice, primarily through my lens of dialogue. Like how does talk really play into the work we do as teaching and in instructional leadership as well. So I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, so the Science of Dialogue, there we'll link to it in the show notes and talk about it at the end, is a Substack, and you are, I guess, maybe weekly or something like that, publishing things. And originally we were talking about doing a sort of salon conversation with a group of people about the dialogue and sort of the tribalism and the education pedagogy wars, which I'm sure will come up here. What was before we go further, because I always find this to be curious and sort of informing the conversation, the way that people think. What was your K-12 education like? Was it down there in the New Orleans area, and was it, how would you characterize the sort of pedagogy and teaching approach, that kind of thing?
So I'm in the building where I graduated from high school.
Nice.
So I went to public K-12 schools from kinder through 12th grade in Southeast Louisiana. There is a kind of a robust Catholic schooling private community around here, especially in New Orleans. But I went to public K-12. That was in the late 90s. Got out, I guess, 01. And to be honest with you, to think through like what teaching and learning looked like at that time, it's hard for me to discern through the fog of time. But there was some divergence. There was a little bit more project-based approaches in history classes. I remember doing a lot of that in history classes. In my English language arts classrooms, there was a lot more kind of direct instruction. How do you craft a literary analysis? How do you blend your quotes? How do you develop strong? So it was kind of a combination at that time. They didn't offer advanced placement at that time. So it was about 25 years ago. But I'm a product of public schools and then public universities in the state of Louisiana as well.
Gotcha. And how would you characterize your teaching this time around, and maybe especially in comparison to what it was I guess the first round?
Yeah, so the first time I was in the classroom, I came to teaching. I got blessed with a job in New Orleans working for a charter, and they were recovery schools at the time. So we were working with kids that were overage and undercredited, and I had become like certified through an alternative program. So at the beginning, I was like really just trying to stay afloat in many ways, which is not altogether dissimilar from many folks in schooling jobs, like trying to discern there's like a bunch of different fronts. There's like 15 different things happening, but it was a pretty challenging environment in New Orleans teaching those first 3 years. So at that time, the way I would characterize my teaching is just trying to figure it out, right? I was trying to follow along with some of my mentors who would use kind of traditional textbooks in English language arts learning. I know that they were teaching things like Animal Farm. There's things that still are taught in high school literature courses now. But a lot of it was kind of we were constructing materials. There was also like Common Core was a big deal at this time, 2010, 2011. So we were trying to kind of negotiate the standards, find the standards, and develop plans that were oriented toward those standards. And that's kind of what I did the first go round. When I reflect on it now, I'm realizing that a lot of my English teaching was a kind of like providing an analysis kind of framework for kids, like a graphic organizer. Like here Soapstone's one of them, for example. I'm not going to throw too much shade, but like kind of asking kids to fill in the blanks in a literary analysis with a text and kind of guiding that process. I did a lot of that when I was in the classroom before, kind of modeling what a good reader would do when they're going through an analytic process. I didn't do a lot of grammar instruction or a lot of things that were kind of more direct or sentence level. In contrast, nowadays, that's what I'm really thinking about. Back in the day, I was thinking more about like at the text level, how do I support your analysis with the text at hand? Now I'm thinking more like granularly inside of those texts themselves. at the paragraph and oftentimes at the sentence level, and trying to be more direct and more explicit with the ways that I'm inviting kids into dealing with the reading of a sentence and dealing with the composition or the writing of at the sentence level, and then going from there. So that's a big difference from where I was and where I am now. I'm really like a lot closer to the granular level in literature at the sentence level with our reading and our writing.
And how's that going?
It's a challenge. Look, like one of the biggest things, and I blogged about this a couple weeks ago, about like really trying to have a clear idea of diagnose where kids are when they arrive to my English 3 classroom. In Louisiana, and I know across the United States, ACT is a big deal with college readiness, especially in the South. So part of my responsibility is to work with kids on ACT English type skills. But trying to do that, and with my knowledge from the research base about prerequisite skill or kind of foundational learning, I've found out that a lot of 11th graders that come in my classroom, like a subject and a verb, a part of speech, a clause and a phrase, these are kind of obscure things for those kids for whatever reason. So a lot of the work has been kind of trying to calibrate where is kind of a zone of proximal development, to use the Vygotsky thing. Where are my kids at? If I have 27 of them in a room, they could be in a variety of places. So it's been kind of trying to discern what is a good entry point for sentence level instruction with kids. And oftentimes I found myself having to reel back even further to start to think about the rudimentary kind of elements of sentences. So that's been a big change. I wasn't even trying to see that the last time I taught it. I wasn't trying to diagnose that. I wasn't thinking about sentence components when I worked with kids. So that's been a whole kind of new ball game.
So this might not be a fair question, but it made me think about it. So I have two daughters, and my youngest daughter is a junior in high school. She's the reason I think it may not be a fair question is because she's taken a social studies class. You teach English, and so. But it made me think of it. She's supposed to be reading and is reading The Jungle, which is, of course, a great book, an interesting book. And the anecdotal stories I get from her about what they're supposed to do with it, I'm thinking, why are we not doing more with this? Why are we not having really rich discussion and the work that I would do as a social studies teacher? But I'm curious, like because you talked about the granular stuff and the sentences and stuff like that, but surely there's more to, when you're teaching a book, and I'm assuming in that case you're talking about teaching a book. What's your process in thinking about, all right, here's a book I'm going to teach, and maybe you have a better example than The Jungle because that's a social studies book more, at least for her. Like, what's your process in thinking, all right, I'm going to teach this book. What do you do, or what are you trying to do in terms of clarifying the outcomes that you want, the things you want students to do with and about and as a result of that reading and that kind of stuff? It basically, sort of your macro planning kind of approach, if that makes sense.
No, that's a good question. Upton Sinclair, right? Is that The Jungle?
Yep.
The interesting
literature.
The related to Zola. I love Zola, French books about like a reality. But when I'm coming back to work in a public school, one of the big things that I was reminded of is that you're kind of at the intersection of a variety of things. There's district or systems level policies about your curriculum map, where you're going. There's a state level kind of expectations, and oftentimes a pressure on a school about how they're evaluated for their performance that presses on the courses inside of the school about what they should or shouldn't be teaching. So when I mentioned a moment ago about ACT English, that's part of my responsibility contractually to work with kids around that. So a reason why I mention that is when I'm teaching a book, right now I'm teaching Great Gatsby to 11th graders, which folks have probably heard plenty about. 100-year anniversary of the Gatsby, by the way. And I'm teaching Frankenstein in an AP literature class right now. So what do I do when I think about that? One thing that's very different from my previous approach, and I kind of hinted at this earlier about like a graphic organizer methods of analysis. I think oftentimes those are really kind of diffuse and like you mentioned in some of our preliminary combos, they're so kind of abstract that when you start to look at chapter 1 or chapter 8 in Upton Sinclair, there's a little bit of a different thing happening there. So what I like to do is I need to understand what my institutional expectations are. What is the school expecting us to do? Is there a curriculum map? What's the state kind of expecting? Because that's important. But then I want to like narrow down the analysis. I don't want to necessarily drop kids into Frankenstein and say any kind of literary device, any kind of characterization, da 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 da. So what I often try to do is have an end goal in mind, and this is a lot of the work I did in educational leadership, trying to clarify for teachers, like, know where you're going to get kids. So if I want them to write a particular type of analysis, so with Gatsby, I know that we want as a team for them to write about the perceptual qualities, like the differences of how characters see one another and how that's conveyed in the literature there. So that becomes a guiding light, a green light, so to speak, in the Gatsby parlance, right? For all my planning. So I know that after a course of 7 to 8 weeks, I want kids to be able to tell me about how Fitzgerald has dealt with themes of perception. Then all throughout our analysis, that's where we're going. I'm highlighting particular paragraphs in particular chapters that reckon with that. So how is someone seeing someone accurately? How is someone seeing someone else inaccurately? Misconceptions or misperceptions. We're often returning to core kind of essential questions that are related to what is that big kind of culmination that we're going to be asking kids to do towards the end of it. And that is how I plan out my little pieces. So if we're looking at chapter 7 in Gatsby today, we're looking at the ways that what characters do and don't know about what's happening. And I'm spotlighting particular elements and working with kids through those so that at the end, they'll have kind of fodder to develop kind of a literary analysis around it, rather than saying, hey, go in here and look for images, look for themes. Here's a list of 5 different devices or whatever it is. It's really a lot more concretely oriented around what that particular text is doing. In the case of Gatsby perception with the eyes is a huge part of that. So it's particular to that text.
So one of the pieces that you published, and I think we maybe went back and forth a little bit on or on social media, was on August 18th, why I'm talking with my students a lot more.
Yeah.
And the sort of preview here on Substack, I'll just read this part of it. I'm talking to my students much more because extended conversations, not content delivery, are actually what build ... So I'm curious, if maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
And as you well know, the sort of conversation, a lot of my conversations center around the sort of what I think is a false binary of like direct or explicit instruction versus, something more inquiry related, and the role of understanding and the importance of knowledge and, all of those kinds of things. So I'm curious, like when as you're unpacking that, maybe a bit through that lens a little bit, because I think that's kind of at least partly what you were kind of getting at there.
Yeah. So the I come from a lane of dialogue, right? So when I emerged into educational leadership, I had opportunities to work with a lot of teacher teams, to visit PLTs, PLCs, ABCs, whatever they call it, clusters. There's a billion different names there, and I'm saying that for a reason, right? Because like we'll often we have a designation for what the teachers in a room together who are talking to one another are doing. There's also like Venables is a famous fellow who writes about protocols or ways to guide teacher collaborations. I'm naming all of that because I think that can be valuable. However, those things are downstream of what we're doing right now, Drew. We're talking. So when I blog about I'm talking to my kids more, that's one thing I'm bringing from my previous experience outside of the classroom, is that oftentimes with kids, we're thinking about the artifact, the graphic organizer where you're landing the evidence from Upton Sinclair, the paragraph that you're developing in a response to Gatsby. Those things can be important and they're great for evaluative tools, but there's a lot of things that are happening before we get there. And what I'm trying to bring more of into my classroom is more of this back and forth before things land in an artifact like that. And I'm inspired by a few core things. There's a woman who does some research. Her name is Sonia Cabell. She recently wrote a book in the last couple of years called Strive for 5 Conversations. And she's done some research where if we're just going back and forth, like, hey, here's my question. What's the theme in Gatsby? The theme in Gatsby is about perception. Great job. That's a limited amount of turns. And her research kind of reveals that if we push with a follow-up question, if we try to go to 4, 5, 6 turns with kids, then we're doing a better job of developing their intellectual capacity, literature knowledge, etc. So that's one thing that's really driving. When I say I'm talking to my kids a lot more. I'm building in places where it's less about you taking this organizer and plugging some words in from the text, which you may have seen it before. Kids get really good at this. Like, oh, you want me to grab evidence? I'll grab a bunch of it. More about the chatter that is happening before that, whether it's one-on-one with me or amongst a small group of kids that are reckoning with the same thing. I'm building in a lot more opportunities for talk, like such as last Friday. We spent the whole entire period talking about a recent article about Frankenstein without even necessarily thinking about the writing elements. Because I think sometimes we get kind of, the teaching gets distorted in service of the artifact at the end of it. And then there's the discourse elements, I think, can really be even more enriching if we don't kind of short shrift them.
So the tension that I mentioned before there that I find to be, again, a little bit, at least a little bit of a false binary of, we either are doing direct or explicit instruction and then maybe some inquiry. Some people even say like 90% and then 10%. Or, there's all these sort of different formulations. And to me, it's much more complex than that, right? There are different things that we want as academic outcomes. There's the matter of efficiency, which, I would think that some people would say, well, that kind of discussion is terribly inefficient. But I also think a part of this is, I'm curious how you think about this, especially reflecting a lot of that sort of efficiency and, for lack of a better term, sort of science of learning kind of approach, which again, I don't want to discount. I don't want to say I'm certainly, I think it's important, but it's only one part of the puzzle. Anyways, a lot of that in my perception is coming from a sort of math kind of background. And when we get into something like, well, I taught social studies, you're teaching, books and language arts, and like, there's I think a different sort of I guess learning, I don't know if it's learning outcomes, but it's not something that builds on something sequentially. It's not algorithmic. It's different, right, than a sort of math kind of approach. And so I'm curious how you've experienced that tension and how you think about that tension, especially given the fact that you're in a language arts classroom, and maybe that's different than, maybe it's not different for you from a math sort of approach.
One of the things that I've really been drawn to in the last 7 years is literature around paradox. So there's a researcher, Wendy Smith, who has done a good bit of work in the leadership realm around paradox. And I go to her definition of a paradox frequently. It's that there are contradictory yet interrelated elements that exist simultaneously and persist over time. So I'll say that one more time. There's a contradictory yet interrelated elements. They exist at the same time, simultaneously, and they persist over time. I'm also drawn to Mary Kennedy's idea about persistent problems in education. And the paradox literature kind of suggests that rather than thinking about like drawing the line at 90-10, whatever, that there's we should always be dealing with a dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic being a key word here, that it's changing, that it may be 90-10 at this moment that I measure it. 2 minutes later, it may be 87, whatever it is, 13. That there's a balance. Well, balance is not the best way to think about it either. There's a dynamism to what is happening. There's I return to the paradox definition because you can't separate those things. So like you said about math, actually coming back to the classroom, I realized that maybe I was not performing a dynamic equilibrium enough, wherein providing enough kind of direction to the kids in my classroom. So I think it was kind of a little bit too amorphous and too kind of broad, where oftentimes kids would be following my lead to figure out what from the text goes in which box. So I've spent some time in an Algebra 3 classroom down the hall for me with one of the previous Louisiana State Teachers of the Year, trying to see how they how she deals with like radicals, mathematics, and how she provides more clarity with examples and providing more kind of affordances to kids to get them into performing a little bit more independently. So I've taken inspiration from her thinking about sentence level instruction. In fact, I've been trying to do bell ringers that are like, solve these sentences, solve the subject verb agreement. There are steps here. I think contrary to kind of like what was suggested a moment ago, there are things that are not stepwise in the humanities or in language arts or literature, but there are stepwise processes that we can use to identify a subject and a verb, to take apart a clause or a phrase, to discern those types of literary differences in texts that we work with. So I'm trying to reckon with this changing equilibrium day to day, right? Some days it's more kind of directive and stepwise. Oftentimes when you work with a sentence in the wild, that's the way I like to describe it, a sentence in the wild, you're going to find something that kind of is in between the steps, you know, like to your point. It's not always a tidy quadratic that can be kind of solved in a certain methodology with a certain process. Again, it demands, I think, especially in the humanities, a sensibility that like whatever was working this moment is probably not going to be the same thing that's working the next moment. There's a contextual thing that I think one of the things I try to drive towards with teachers is that we need to be adaptive and resist the invitation to name that we've found the best practice that we're going to apply in the same ratio every moment. So that's been a big part of what it's been like to come back.
Yeah. So then that begs a question, at least in my mind, is how do you know and how are you gauging, how are you perceiving, how are you figuring out in those moments when and how to make those shifts? Because, you know, certainly formative assessment is really important. What are the things that you're doing as formative assessments, and how are you, I guess, making sure or striving to make sure that those formative assessments are giving you an accurate sort of perception so that you can obviously take the next steps that are the right ones?
Yeah, so I'm tinkering a good bit. I've always been kind of experimental. One thing about coming back from 7 years out of the classroom is that my systems and structures I had built, I'm not sure where they are and which Google Drive or whatever it is. And as much as there are a plethora of instructional resources in an institution such as this, they're really kind of oftentimes incoherent and kind of siloed. Again, like teaching being vocational is very personally driven. But by its nature, I'm like bringing my beliefs and my kind of personality into it. So I must admit, for these last 2 months, I've been kind of shooting in different directions. I'm trying to get formative information about how kids can read a sentence, like what parts can they identify. I'm zooming in on, okay, we have words, we have phrases that don't have a subject and verb, and we have clauses that have a subject and verb. And I'm trying to shore that up. I'm spending a lot of time trying to diagnose where I have 51 kids in 2 sections, where they are in that rudimentary fundamental piece right there, because it's critical for their success in ACT English, their success in discerning what F. Scott Fitzgerald is saying in his book. So I've kind of had to shoot into a bunch of different directions. I've tried to ask them more about dependent and independent clauses and kind of learned that was a kind of an aspirational. So I've done formative assessment in that way at the beginning of my period. Solve the sentences. I'm trying to get a read on where kids are with identification of subject and verb. Oftentimes, I'm finding that it's unclear to me, so I need to shore up my content knowledge. But to get back to kind of the core of what I understand your question to be, like to me, it's like my text question or text to answer earlier. If I'm teaching Upton Sinclair in the Jungle, then my questions are oriented to what is inside of that text in general, not an abstraction, not even an abstraction of like politicized literature, to be honest. Like what is, because there's a variety of examples there, but I think that can kind of distort how we approach that one. I'm looking at particular concrete examples. This particular sentence, we use like mentor sentences in that way. This particular text. So I'm orienting my assessment or diagnosis around particular items, and it has to change with the next item. So when we teach a different book in the next few weeks, it's going to change depending upon what is inside that text. When I'm looking at a different set of sentences or different set of grammatical exercises, it really is contingent upon that particular exercise, especially what I find in the humanities. Like to your point, about sometimes in more scientific or mathematical realms, there's a concreteness, a linearity that is a little bit more predictable and dependable. So I'm drawn within humanities and literature to like everything's based around a particular example, particular case. What's the text that we're dealing with? What's the sentence? Abstractions around that, I think, can be invite more confusion. It makes it challenging to get a read. It's where do I find what is the fundamental? What is the anchor? What are the pillars that are holding it up? And I'm zooming in. Like one teacher here that I've really admired is she says you got to start at the sentence level with prepositions because you can get them all out of the way and get to the subjects and verbs. So I'm still trying to figure that out. But I'm trying to think through like what is that reading fundamental? What is that writing fundamental? And then kind of expanding from there. So I don't know if that really addresses everything you're thinking about there.
Well,
but that's part of my thought process.
So I think about, as you were talking, especially towards the end there, some of the things that you're mentioning strike me as something like surface learning, like prepositions and things like that, which are really important. I like Hattie's framework of surface deepen transfer. And so like finding that balance between the things that obviously you're called to help them learn, things like prepositions and verbs and sentence structure and things like that. But then also with a book like Great Gatsby or whatever it might be, really wrestling with some of the bigger sort of concepts and dilemmas and tensions and things like that, right? So I guess whether you use surface deeper transfer or depth of knowledge or whatever framework you're familiar with, I'm wondering how you I guess think about those different things and how they, I guess, affect your planning, the formative assessment, and then the work. And I'll add another piece here because I know we had a comment. One of the things about like the idea of critical thinking and the importance of knowledge in that. So surface learning, surface knowledge. Does somebody need to know a preposition to be able to understand the big concepts of the Great Gatsby? And probably not. But like how do you reconcile and balance those things?
Well, you're right. I mean, like I just said, I'm not brushing up. I'm developing my concrete understanding of grammatical elements. And that is me as a person who's read plenty classic literature, has reckoned with Don Quixote, Cervantes, Tolstoy, Japanese novels, stuff from all over the place without necessarily knowing the phrases and clauses that are there. So part of the reason why I'm trying to talk to kids, there was this fellow I worked with in my ed leadership days doing professional learning that would say that that would make a distinction between an expression of understanding and a written expression of understanding. And he would say that kids can kind of think at a sophisticated level or speak even at a sophisticated level, even though their writing might not look that way. So one of the impetuses for me to talk to my kids more is because I think that oftentimes when we're trying to see in an artifact, a written artifact to teach a kid's learning, that we're because of their some gaps in their technical ability with constructing a sentence, that we're not able to see their thinking that is complex, that has a sophistication to it. So I'm emphasizing talk in my classroom because I know kids can think complexly without even necessarily being able to construct a paragraph that looks complex in a traditional sense. So I try to separate those in. That's what we talk a lot about Gatsby. We had a 17 question full class discussion on last Friday about Gatsby and King Midas and de Tocqueville, and it was less about, for me, them being able to develop a paragraph with a blended quote that has the MLA APA citation or whatever it is, just being able to reckon with the complex ideas of ambition and perception in storytelling. And you would find that kids can talk about it with a sophistication that is ultimately not surprising. But if we're only looking at the technical, superficial kind of, as you characterized it, then we're not seeing a kid's thinking. So that's why I'm trying to bring more talk into my classroom, because I recognize that kids have complex thought. They make inferences. They got themselves to this place. If I don't see it in their well-constructed, well-spelled, complex sentence writing, that doesn't mean it's not there. So it's a dynamism between those elements. Like I want to be able to help kids know those rudiments so that they can enhance their own expression of their sophisticated thinking. But what I often find is that kids can think in a sophisticated manner. It's just the especially in a literature classroom, getting their expression of it in the ways that we recognize it in a scholarly discourse, in a written text, is a different thing. But we can talk about that too, because that's not always the expectation of post K-12 learning at the collegiate nor in the workplace, that that everything is kind of governed by the way we can put it in a text. So that's another thing that kind of is big for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure I have a question here, but just I think that's one thing that I've noticed, and it seems to be again a real sort of friction point with some of the sort of pedagogy wars, that kind of thing, is this matter of like the way that you described it there. You're talking about making thinking visible, right? Making their thinking, getting what's in their heads out so that you can correct it, build on it, reinforce it, whatever. And I think it seems clear to me that a lot of the science of learning kinds of rhetoric is maybe dismissive of that kind of approach because it's less efficient. And feel free and please disagree with me if you feel differently. The idea that one would, maybe in the service of efficiency, not do that discussion, not do that dialogue, not do that talk, because it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And so, I'm curious how you think about that.
So there's this fella who's an educational researcher. His name is Adam Lepstein, and him and some colleagues have done a lot of work. I think that he did a paper on dichotomous discourse that I've shared with you. He's done a lot of work around teacher collaborative talk, teacher collaborative discourse. His research has really helped me kind of enter into the scholarship of talk. There's a good bit of scholarship of talk in schooling environments where there's positionality of a teacher and the pupils or students. There's a little less research that looks at the talk amongst adults about teaching and learning, and that's kind of why I've ended up with the science of dialogue itself. But like I said a little while ago, I think even when we look at teacher learning, we're usually thinking about the protocol and the steps, the text, the artifact of it, rather than the talk that is actually enacted. The way that I've described this to folks before, it's like you can go to a school and you can see two different teams that use the same protocol, that their planning looks totally different. Not that it sounds different. It is different. The being of it is different. And my argument is that it's different because that's downstream of the talk. There's a discourse. I know you're an inquiry person. There's a dialogue. There's a discourse that's enacting this protocol. It's not just living in steps on a page. There are people that are doing it, and it's dynamic. It's not stopping. And
there's
that's the same thing.
Cultural kind of.
It's more. It's situated within their cultural milieu. It is not necessarily all the way determined, but conditioned at least by what is happening around them. It's oftentimes unfair to say there's a boundary around that meeting with the rest of the work that's happening in that building, though we tend to examine teacher learning as if it was happening in this concrete 45 minutes and not outside of it. So his research has really kind of inspired me to think about like the relationship of talk to the artifacts that we oftentimes can examine. I get why folks want to see a kid's writing. I get why they want to see a graphic organizer that shows a kid determining a central idea, finding pieces of evidence, and making some elaboration about it. I am also trying to get to that magical downstream point where kids can develop scholarly writing that will serve them in a post-secondary environment. But I think oftentimes we're trying to negotiate that. We're trying to make the artifact exist without necessarily tending to the talk that allows it, the discourse, the impromptu spontaneity that is happening before it. So Lepstein and colleagues have done some research into looking at different classrooms and seeing like which kind of discussions have kind of more effect on kids' learning. And one of the research bits, I can find it and send it to you, but I think I blogged about it recently. They looked at two different classrooms, and both of them had a discussion. One of them, the discussion was about a flood, and the teacher had a very well prescribed definition of a flood, and it stilted the conversation because the teacher was trying to drive kids towards a preconception. And in the other classroom, it was messier, to your point, but a kid challenged the educator's conception of what a story was and wasn't, and that led to a more robust and conversation at depth, but it was a lot messier. So when I had my conversations in my classrooms last Friday, I accepted that it will be messier because I want it there to be a depth and more of a realism oftentimes, right? So rather than trying to drag you to my preconception as the educator in the room, I wanted to keep open to potential different interpretations because that can situate that at more depth for the kids that are in the room. So their research kind of inspires me in many ways to be like, bite the bullet, make it messy. If it's not efficient, that's not always the goal. I'm not always trying to be efficient every day. Some days it is about efficiency. Some moments it isn't. I don't think it's kind of a either or there either. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So that efficiency, I want to make the case for the importance of having knowledge and this is something that I mentioned earlier. You had posted something on LinkedIn about critical thinking and a blog piece that I think, I agree with as well in lots of ways. So that the assertion is, and I've heard this in a number of different places, that one can't think critically without knowledge about something and domain specific. I responded that I think that that's not as precise as I would like it.
Sure.
I think it's true that I think it's self-evidently true that we can think critically without knowledge about something, but we can't think deeply critical or think critically deeply. Maybe that's the way to put it. Because that knowledge does help inform the critical thinking. And so as I've been really thinking about critical thinking lately and thinking, the claim that, that critical thinking is not transferable, it's domain specific. And I think that's true, but I think there's also a different kind of critical thinking that's more generalized. And there's some research that shows that. All of that to say, it is really important. And I talk with inquiry sort of minded people and teachers about this quite often, is that let's not dismiss the role of knowledge, and let's make sure that we are building that knowledge, because that is what unlocks the deeper kind of critical thinking, especially in that domain. And so we want to make sure that that's happening. How do you how have you been sort of trying to get to do that in your classroom, to get them to some of those bigger concepts and bigger kinds of things? Because if they don't know anything about the sort of scene and setting and era of The Great Gatsby, for example, then they are going to really struggle to make, really interesting thoughts about that. They might be pretty superficial about the characters and the way they talk or something like that. So how have you sort of been working to build that knowledge that then opens up some of those bigger questions and critical thinking?
Well, I'm glad you sent that comment, because I've been reflecting on that. So I had shared Whitney Wielden, another state teacher of the year from Louisiana, who blogs about knowledge's role. And I must admit, kind of full disclosure, I've done a lot of work with the State Department in the last 10 years here about knowledge's role in especially literacy teaching. And we tried to bring to teachers and leaders 3 kind of core shifts around evidence, complexity, and knowledge in literacy teaching. So I'm oftentimes thinking about knowledge. Before I came in this fall, I was thinking about my English 3 class as like, we're going to do flappers. We're going to do the 1920s, the roaring 20s, and all this kind of stuff, which was me kind of like overcompensating in my view now that I reflect in a knowledge realm. So when I shared her blog, I realized, like, you pushed back by saying like it's not as precise. We can do critical thinking without knowledge. I realized that when I shared her blog, I said the way I said it was like, we can't think critically without first knowing stuff. And I recognize that me saying that is taking a side. It's creating, in my view, a false dichotomy. It's suggesting that there's one that comes before the other, that we have to know things before we think about them. Whereas I'm more of a yin and yang person. And I know that might sound obscure, but if you follow my blog enough, I will draw upon philosophical and spiritual sources, such as like Rumi or Kabir, some very famous folk around our world. What I'm recognizing here that I did the thing that I try to argue against, where I suggested at least that one was prior to the other, when the reality is, like in a yin and yang, there's a seed of the other inside of one another. They're not separable. That's why I go back to Wendy Smith's definition about a paradox, that they are interrelated and interdependent, that they cannot be separated from one another. But part of what I encounter in the learning discourse, and I do it myself, is that sometimes when we're making an argument, we're trying to make a case or advocate. I know that you do a good bit of that. And then by the nature of making that argument, I foreclose other positions. So that's not I'm not trying to defend it too much by saying that. I think that I just want to recognize that I did it too.
It's the nature of the beast, though.
So that is all to say that I'm trying to coach myself into not thinking about one separate from the other. That I'm cultivating critical thinking without any knowledge element, or I'm cultivating knowledge without any critical thinking. They're oftentimes interrelated. And even in your description just now, which I think is very apt, right? So if kids don't know about Prohibition, they don't know about game in the World Series in 1919, they don't know about jazz, they don't know about eugenics, as awful as it is. Those things play into the Gatsby. And kids now, 100 years on, aren't in that cultural milieu. When people read that book 100 years ago, that was kind of top of mind. The stuff about banking and about big money was like part of the milieu at that time, so it was more easily discernible. But there are more abstracted knowledge elements that kids do bring, even if they don't know about the 20s, that can still apply to the Gatsby. I know it doesn't give them a full-throated understanding of everything that Fitzgerald is evoking there, but kids do know about superficiality. They do know about pretending. They do know about denial. They do know about trying to be a certain way because of how you want other folks to see you. I know we get into generality there, but what the key thing for me is, like, I try to bring, at the beginning of this semester, I was trying to bring a lot of knowledge, but then I realized that I also need to kind of pull in what kids already know, what they're already bringing, and kind of do a little bit more dynamic equilibrium. Not necessarily bring them a bunch of texts from the 20s about a skyscraper and a new car, and try to like just really just dump knowledge on them so that they can bring criticality. I think that would be kind of an affront to kids oftentimes, because I do believe that they have criticality as a dignified human being. It's just like in between those. Every day it's a little bit different. I'm bringing more knowledge some days. I'm drawing upon their knowledge of interpersonal dynamics and human relationships on others, and it's kind of a balance. I haven't perfected it. I'm still in the course of the first semester of bringing it back here, but those are some things that are part of my decision making.
Yeah, and again, I'm thinking about the jungle, and as a social studies teacher, the rich discussions and things that one could have, but you can't have those with high school juniors if they don't understand the Industrial Revolution, immigration issues, regulations of the government, some of those big questions. And as I was talking with my daughter, and she clearly doesn't know some of those things. And so, I was thinking, as you were talking, like, would it make sense? And I think lots of the sort of science of learning advocates would say, so you should front load some of those concepts or all of those concepts or something like that before you read it. That way they would have some context, and maybe that's right. But then I also think there's some real value in not necessarily front loading them. And as they're reading and as you're unpacking it, if you have time, and that's always an issue in every classroom, those things as they come up start to become, you could imagine a kid asking questions, or a teacher asking questions, or asking them to consider some part of the story that then would lead you to say, well, let's talk about immigration because this is an issue, or jazz, or whatever it might be. And so, again, not a question there, but just a sort of reflection, that, again, there's not necessarily one way to do it. And I think you could probably make an argument that some teachers could do the sort of latter example I gave and be really, really successful, and other teachers could try that and be really unsuccessful. And the opposite is probably true as well.
So I have to say that I might have a little bit of bias here. So as I've said, I've done a lot of work in Louisiana around curricular materials. And one of the things that's kind of I'm attached to and I believe in the efficacy of is focusing on the text. Shanahan has a famous article about this, letting the text take center stage. And that is like fundamental to my approach. Why am I saying that right now? Is because what is the text that we're reading? If we're reading Gatsby, let's read Gatsby. That doesn't mean we're going to spend 3 weeks trying to figure out skyscrapers and the Jazz Age and all this other kind of stuff before we get to Gatsby. That doesn't mean we won't look at the Lost Generation, the impact of World War I right before we start reading it. We may do that, but the text is really central to what we're going to do. So we're getting into the text as quickly as we can. And then kind of like what you said is often what I do. Like we've read several chapters of Gatsby. We go look at an article about fixing the 1919 World Series. That's when he's meeting Meyer Wolfsheim in the book. And that knowledge is going to be important for kids to discern a critical moment in the plot there. I'm not necessarily doing it all at the beginning and asking, like checking their understanding to see, like, do you have a robust understanding of the Roaring Twenties so that now we can read Gatsby. It's kind of a both and in many ways, which was what I started my blog thinking about all the time. Is neither putting all the knowledge in one place and then doing the text. It's more of along the way. But I like to think of the conception of the text is at the center of it. So if I'm teaching Upton Sinclair, let's start reading Upton Sinclair. Oftentimes what happens when teachers are trying to build knowledge affordances to kids to help them access the text, that they're dumping knowledge on kids without necessarily trying to diagnose if they knew any of that, right? I'm not saying that every kid knows industrialization, but amongst the 51 in this room, there's probably some of them that do. So I have to try to find a way while we're getting, my guiding light is the text. I'm trying to get us into that text. And along the way, we may want to build in more robust pieces of knowledge. Some of them I have named in my planning beforehand. Some of them emerge as I'm in dialogue with my kids about what they know and don't know about what's happening in that text. Again, like I haven't brought it up yet, but the talk piece, like the blog you brought up, like why am I talking to my kids a lot? It's because I'm trying to be aligned with them. I'm drawn to an interactive alignment model of what talk is. I need to know what they know. And I need to ask them a ton of questions about that because there's so many invitations to assume that kids have arrived here and they don't know enough about Gatsby to know about it. They may know about boom and bust in an economy. They may know about gangsters and the superficiality of appearance. They might not know about it in the Fitzgerald context, but I caution folks to do a lot of front loading oftentimes because you don't really know where kids are, and you may be depriving them an experience of encountering things in a more organic way through the text. So I go back to what's the text? Let the text be at the center of it, and as we go along, maybe our knowledge affordances should be integrated along, kind of like the way you described it.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious how you, especially given your experience being back in the classroom, and it hasn't been, I think 7 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
So not a whole year, and
yeah.
Certainly lots more reflection to happen.
Sure.
How, if you were able to, give a keynote to a group of educators about the sort of tension between, the pedagogy war, the more traditional direct or explicit instruction, and the research and the science of learning versus something more inquiry, or some versions of that, right? However you want to characterize those things, and especially thinking about the research and the way we use research, the way we think about research as teachers, the way we don't think about research and don't engage with research, all of those kinds of wrinkles, right? What would your keynote maybe be? Would it focus on for teachers that are really engaged in that conversation and that sort of debate, as it were?
So I came to teaching when I was almost 30. So I did some artistic work prior to coming to teaching. I did creative writing, I did musical work, I did work around, my wife is a fine artist, so I worked in humanities. If I was given a keynote, I would go to Rumi. Rumi has a famous story called The Elephant in the Dark, and it talks about how something has arrived in this town. A mysterious thing has arrived in this dark room, and all these different folks in that community come to investigate it. And they stick a hand in and they say, hey, this feels like a water pipe. It must be a water pipe. Another one sticks a hand in and says, this feels like a fan. It must be a fan. Another sticks a hand in and says, this feels like a pillar. It must be like a building, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the light comes on, they realize it's an elephant. That each of them have a particular perspective that is guiding how they interpret what they're seeing. So I would start there. I'm oftentimes a science skeptic, but the reason why I talk about dialogue and I name it as a science of dialogue is that we can look at how folks coordinate their interpretations. And I think that is a really critical element when we look at educational leadership and teaching. Is you may hear someone say something that seems to contradict your understanding, that it's a fan or that it's a pillar or those types of things. But what a more humble and Socratic way, in my view, would be to, in good faith, try to understand why they may be perceiving it a little bit differently from that point of view. And there's science to think about that. There's a woman named Gail Fairhurst who writes about discursive leadership and framing. And like when I posted about Whitney's thing about knowledge, I framed it in a certain way that named that knowledge would be at the beginning of that. So knowing about how we frame our conversations can be really important. I can frame them differently. I don't have to frame it in a dichotomous way. I framed it dichotomously there. So being aware of that when you enter conversations, giving grace to folks who may frame things in ways that you wouldn't frame them. Like maybe they're maybe don't know about why they're framing it as a trunk or as a fan or as a, you don't know their vantage point, right? That's another thing I get from the dialogue literature from Bakhtin. One of my favorites is that everybody has their own address, that I'm in this place and time right now in Louisiana in this chair at 3:14 Central Time, whatever it is. No one else shares my position, and the folks that I'm interacting with have their own position. So that's just to me, that's a demonstrable, scientific, objective fact. We're in different places. So I need to reckon with that when I talk to you. Like, I need to know that you're not in my position. You didn't, your past wasn't the same, your present isn't the same, and your future isn't going to be the same. So my keynote would be about, that would be an entry point to say, hey, we're always interactively aligning. So if you have a conception that you're bringing to the conversation, you want to try to understand where other folks are and maybe find where they are and then bring them to your place. One of the core pieces of explicit research I did under interactive alignment was if two people were trying to talk to one another about how to navigate a maze, and they realized that unconsciously folks would kind of bundle around particular terms without realizing that they were doing it, because they would kind of come to a norm about how are we using this word direct? How are we using this word assessment? How are we using this word close read? How are we using, all of these terms that get tossed around everywhere in education, but just being cognizant that I need to ask more questions. I need to talk to you more about it so that I am not bringing my assumptions about what I think you believe that term means. So that's why I go to the Rumi story. Like, you might not know the whole picture. Oftentimes you don't. In the moments that you think you do, you should be more like Socrates and be like, maybe I don't. Maybe my assumptions and my priors are blinding me to a bigger reality that may be better, may better help us serve the kids that we're trying to work with in our schools.
It reminds me of the sort of fundamental question of facilitative questioning that I talk about with, working with kids, is the different versions you can ask. What makes you say that? What's the evidence for that? Or why do you think that? Or tell me more, those kinds of questions. Are you, I guess, when you think about research and your background in educational leadership, and you've mentioned, research, you've mentioned thinkers and all these kinds of things. I think it's a fundamental problem, or maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's just a fact. It's just a feature or a bug or both of teachers and their engagement or lack of engagement with educational research. There's a number of reasons why. Some of it's time, some of it's preparation, some of it's all kinds of things. Especially given your background and work in educational leadership, and then now working as a teacher with teachers in the trenches, as they say, like, how do you think about the ways in which teachers should and do and maybe don't engage with educational research as it informs their practice?
Well, Again, if you follow my Substack or some of my thinking on the socials, and as I mentioned a little while ago, I came to teaching after being in humanities and being in the arts. I'm a Thomas Kuhn person, the structure of scientific revolutions. I'm a scientism skeptic oftentimes. Why do I say that? Because I think we lose track in the kind of contemporary and modern era of some of the philosophical underpinnings of our knowing. I'm a person that wants to talk about epistemology. Like, of course, there's a knowledge of the academy that is encoded in our scientific discourse that folks like you talk about it a lot, like Enlightenment discourse and Francis Bacon and scientific processes and ways that we can vet a particular type of knowledge. The thing, there are other ways of knowing, and I know that that's a disputed, contested claim that folks find kind of problematic. But the teachers that are in this building, they know things. They may not have encoded it in a scientific process in a scholarly journal that is peer reviewed, but there are knowledges that folks have in this building. They're in front of kids day to day. They are seeing stimulus and response, if you want to use the scientific terminology, right? So I don't think that there should be an onus on the teachers to reckon with the academy in a scientific sense. I'm drawn to folks who do like knowledge brokerage. I think there's out of Delaware, there's a group now that is talking about that more, about how do we trade knowledge, or how do we what's the interface between a scientific community of researchers that's doing what folks like to say is like really the research controlled trial, like the gold standard of research. The folks that are kind of negotiating what is found in those clinical settings and what is actually happening in a classroom. But I like to emphasize that there is knowing in a building. Even kids that arrive in kindergarten, they have done a lot of things in 5 years. Parents know a lot of things. It doesn't look the same. It's not presented with what is kind of an institutional robustness of the publication in a journal. I'm not saying that we should think about them the same way, but I also am saying that we shouldn't dismiss what is colloquially known oftentimes. So to your question about research, I think that there should be knowledge brokerage. There should be folks in buildings that are educational leaders that can bridge that gap. We should be developing our capacity to bring findings of research into classrooms and schools where it can better affect kids or can refine what's happening. But also we should be thinking about framing. We should know the science of dialogue if we're trying to do that. We should be knowing that our own talk is either foreclosing or inviting the knowledge of teachers in those rooms. Unfortunately, too often we're bringing knowledge to teachers that is patronizing or condescending and pretending that teachers don't know things. And that can be an impediment or an obstacle to our shared kind of project of better serving kids and communities. So I don't like kind of the ivory towerness of like, hey, the institution says this, and you obviously don't know about it in your little school in Arkansas. Like, of course, there are things that the Stanford, Harvard, whatever knows about that might help us in our little school in El Dorado, Arkansas, in the middle of nowhere. But there are things there as well. So the brokerage is kind of the in between, like recognizing the epistemology of the teacher that is not of the ivory tower, and kind of reconciling that with what we do get from vetted and important investigations that are happening in a more cloistered environment. It's just that we've got to do both of those, but we can't expect teachers to be out there reading all the research, trying to apply it in their classroom. I mean, I think that's burdensome oftentimes if we try to put that on teachers.
Yeah, it's not like teachers are blessed with tremendous amounts of time. And
have mercy. One thing that I've realized in the last 8 weeks is that there's like no time to breathe. And if you have 30 seconds, you better go make your copies right now, because who knows if you're ever going to have another moment. But you are right about that.
Yeah. But that, having somebody or some people in the building who can bring that, which also I think is important, as I think you're referring to, is that bring that, then I think there's a responsibility to say, well, let's talk about this. Let's think about this, not just say, this is what the evidence says, this is what we do, boom, 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 sort of formulaically. this is an audio podcast, and I do want to make sure people understand that Rod is talking with his hands very demonstrably. So he's diagramming things, he's moving things around. Maybe we should go to video, and this is the final nail on the coffin of why I should go to video podcasts. But I want to wrap us up here.
Yeah.
Obviously, give you an opportunity to share links and things like that. But is there anything that we have not talked about that we should, given your experience and your 7 weeks back in the classroom and your blog and all of those things?
Thank you for the invitation, Drew, to kind of chat. It's hard in a classroom. It's a grind. It's difficult. It's really brought to light how it's kind of easy to think in a reform lane about the things that can be applied in the classroom, all tidily and all this kind of stuff. The variety of variables that you kind of have to deal with, like where's the Chromebook, where's the charger, there's a scheduling day, and all this kind of stuff. Then the logistics of schooling present many challenges to quality instruction. So that's really top of mind. Considering our last topic, I know I brought up Thomas Kuhn. One of the things that I think is really relevant from his work around science is that in the ivory tower, we can kind of be kind of self-reinforcing about our paradigms, but the reality on the ground working with kids is where paradigms shift. And that's where our anomalous findings, if you think about the Kuhn kind of conception, that challenge our previous paradigms, that's where it happens. So now in the discourse, I think that you and I kind of see, folks have been a lot about CLT and cognitive load theory, but there's some like kind of emerging kind of interest in predictive processing. That's an example of a paradigmatic shift that is happening because we're attending even more closely to what's really happening in classrooms. And to me, that's what Bakhtin and dialogue says. It's not over. It never is over. There's a dynamism to our life that the world continues to turn. So my final thought here is that, like, every time Lefstein writes about this, Better Than Best Practice is one of his books, is that we're invited to think about a best practice that we want to stamp and get out there into the world, but there's a better. And better is a little bit more refining of a term to use there, because it doesn't suggest that this practice is going to work in every context and we figured it out. I'm also like averse to words like solving, you know, like some things are managed rather than solved. Tensions are managed rather than solved. If we're trying to solve education by saying it's inquiry or direct, we're never going to get there. That's not a solution. There's an interdependence that is there, you know. That's a big part of it for me. But those are some things that are lingering after this conversation, Drew. And thank you again for taking the opportunity to chat about it.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I really appreciate the conversation. I also appreciate, I was in the classroom for 15 years, and it's been quite some time. And sometimes I joke when I'm working with teachers, and you say, like, newsflash, teaching is really hard, and going back to that grind, I appreciate your grind and your willingness to do so. And perhaps we'll check in as you have another 7 weeks or 14 or whatever. Yeah. So
I'm looking forward to January, I will say, because I'm on a semester schedule now, right? So, and it's not because I don't like the kids. It's because you get to reboot, you get to, all right, here are the things that I can, I've experimented a lot. I know I mentioned that. But like, I'm trying to find where's that zone, where kids, where can I better serve kids, and having that opportunity to start again in January is exciting as well.
All right, so make sure your blog. Where can they find you? Your blog, any social media or anything like that?
Okay, so I'm Rod J Naquin everywhere on socials. That RodJNaquin.substack is the best way to follow me. Through my Substack, you can find what I'm doing weekly, as Drew mentioned earlier today. I do that weekly during the semesters. I also make a audio version of that blog that I'm putting out weekly through the Science of Dialogue podcast. And Rod J Naquin is where you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on X, Twitter. Those are the best ways to connect with what I'm kind of doing, what I'm thinking about, and the conversations that I'm involved in. So thanks again, Drew.
Yeah, and the Substack that you mentioned, you gave the address, and just a reminder, you can probably find it by searching for the Science of Dialogue. But we'll put all those in the show notes, and appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, the science of dialogue also includes gestures, like you pointed out, right? So there you go. But Drew, it's been a blessing. You have a blessed day, my friend.
Yep, you too.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.